Railroading history has been made possible over the years since the start of the 1830s. Older railroads, ones that had not been known so well over the years, have quickly become a larger subject by today's standards. Because after all, the pioneering days as well as the infancy days of railroading in the United States, especially along the East Coast, when they were beginning to sprawl up and take place. They began a lot of operations, becoming quick in the faces of keeping the load commerce in action and also maintaining both economics and transport of people and goods to various places every which way. Essentially making horse-drawn carriages and wagons not as effective. And it's true that trains had way more capacity and way more power to draw up a lot of goods and passengers to and from places. But as we know by now, even in the old days, the pioneering days were still a point in which rail travel had not gone so well. One case that could be spoken of is with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the soon-to-be president of New York Central. Way before he even joined up with New York Central, he was a passenger involved in this disaster. So for today, let's talk a bit about the 1833 disaster known as Hightstown. Our story begins with the railroad that was involved at the time of the accident. In particular, it is known as the Camden and Amboy Railroad and Transportation Company, otherwise known as simply Camden and Amboy, or CNA, for even shorter. It was first established in New Jersey in 1830, when a majority of chartering throughout the Camden and Amboy areas, throughout Delaware and Raritan Canal, as well as various other areas across the Northeast Corridor, which nowadays is seemingly one of the most busy areas of railroading as of today. It was first put together through Camden and Amboy, but not exactly the oldest railroad as it stands, because in the United States, the true oldest railroad would have to go to Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O. The railroad itself was among the first, however, to greatly put together New Jersey-based load commerces. Various passengers and freight would be carried through various points of transportation by the railroads, horse-drawn wagons, and etc. Joint companies, as the terminology caught on over time, was mainly the means to allow for railroading in the state of New Jersey as well as elsewhere. Of course, CNA would eventually be overtaken by the likes of the United New Jersey Railroad and Canal Company. And even later after that, there were others that would eventually go even higher. The Pennsylvania Railroad would be the finalizing victor in the faces of railroading as it would turn out. And it was certainly the largest public corporation by this time, and eventually throughout the rest of the United States. It stood to be one of the most legendary railroads in the olden days of railroading. The date is November 8th, 1833. It was a fairly decent morning despite the weather becoming a bit colder by this time, and also, having taken place early in the morning, the cold temperatures were still coming around. However, this was not going to play a factor into today's story. A train in particular, in which the consist was not well known, including the locomotive as well as the type of coaches, were all ready to go to Bordentown. From the station of South Amboy, the train was scheduled to arrive in Bordentown within the next hour or so. However, what would happen was that, despite departing from South Amboy on time, the train would eventually have to make a stop because of some complaints about the wheels making some noise. The crew would get out, proceed to make some oil and adjustments to ensure the axles are working okay, and then they would be off again. However, What they didn't know was that the wheels themselves weren't much of a problem, but it was in fact an axle bearing known as a journal box. You see, these were common back in the day. But if there's one thing that we can all agree with, journal boxes are notorious for one little issue. They can sometimes catch fire through improper maintenance. But this was, however, the first of its kind. And little did the crew realize that when the fire broke out and the smoke started billowing, they would unfortunately have a disastrous end to the journey. The hotbox grew until the train's axle would snap. And one of the coaches would make a massive derailment, with the rest of the coaches following behind and ending up in various spots. Some of which would remain upright, others would go on their sides, and some would accumulate more damage than others. While not much is exactly known about how the whole thing went down, it was clear that something went wrong with the axle bearings. A hotbox that occurred in the journal bearings of one of the wheels ended up overheating and causing the axle to snap and eventually cause a derailment. The crew, however, had no idea that the journal box was going to end up like this. Otherwise, this disaster would have likely been prevented. Despite stopping to have the wheels oiled up, that was basically not the issue at hand that led up to the derailment. 2 people, however, ended up dead as a result of this accident, while 21 others would be injured. And there were plenty of people that were well known over the years. Entrepreneur Cornelius Vanderbilt, who would later go on to found New York Central, despite making a vow to never ride on trains again. There was also former US President John Quincy Adams, and even actor Tyrone Power, who himself had wrote an eyewitness account claiming that this was the worst disaster that ever befell his eyes. You could say that for 1833, it was not something to be taken lightly. Despite being the first of its kind to have a hotbox related derailment, it was still pretty horrible by that time, despite today, where the standards are even more higher, and the death toll has been seen in much higher rates. I guess that's just the thing about times supposedly being simpler back then. Investigators, of course, came around and found out that the culprit was indeed the mechanical failures of the journal bearing and hand, which hotboxed and eventually caused the derailment via snapping the axles. The crew weren't exactly put on immediate blame for the accident, and not much more can be identified through much of anything else. But the point is, this was the first major role in history that led up to an enormous amount of accidents, following improper maintenance and lubrication and maintenance work for these journal bearings. And despite having a lot of accidents, the journal bearings would stick around for more than a century after Hightstown, 1833. Perhaps the biggest known disaster relating to a hotbox would have to be mentioned from 1943, when a Labor Day Congressional Limited run in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, ended up allowing for a coach to hotbox to the point in which that it also caused the derailment. That wreck killed 79 and injured over 111 people. However, this is an entirely different story, which has in fact been talked about. Any of us can agree that Hightstown is something that we don't want to have a repeat of ever again. But even more so, with the loads of technology that have shown up, including the more popular roller bearings, we can at least agree. It's accidents like these that helped shape the railroad towards a brighter future and hopefully a more safer, regulated system, which will in fact allow for much more with less technology.